So tonight, again, just a reminder, is explicitly in regards to security documentation. If you have questions about other things, you're confused, because I know you got all of your AWS credentials and you might be lost, confused, maybe your head is in the cloud. Please make sure you put in a ticket. Don't bring those up here. We just don't want to confuse people who may be joining at the precise moment you ask a question, or just throwing things all over the place. So put a ticket in. Also be sure you're putting a ticket in the right ticket section so that the right people answer your ticket in a timely fashion. So just so those who are on, engagement is meant for all of the fun activities. So do not put a ticket into the Discord for engagement for anything AWS related. Put those into the appropriate areas, whether that is a rules related question, an AWS ICS question, or in particular, if future ones, if it's a security documentation question, you can throw it in that section. All right, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the folks who are leading this section, which is David up here. He is the master of the template. So he will run through all things security documentation for you. So I'm going to hand it on over to you, David.
All righty, thank you, Amanda. Glad to have everybody here. We've also got Ann Wright-Mockler on the call as well. All right, so we're going to start out with some interaction. Can everyone that's an English major please, speak up in the chat? If you're an English major, all right. And that's precisely the point here. I'm not seeing any comments there, but one of the things I learned early on in my career is if I really liked writing, I would have been an English major, but there was a reason why I studied math and computer science. That does not mean that I don't write. In fact, writing is absolutely essential to my career. It just means that if I had loved writing, I would have been an English major. Instead, I'm a computer science major that had to learn to write. So that's one of the pieces of this competition that we really try and stress is the value of writing and communicating. That's the point of the documentation. Case in point, I'm in a 2-day cybersecurity supply chain risk management conference. Somebody asked one of the panels today, what's one of the things that you want the new hires, the new students and such to really learn? And they just emphasized, again, a point had been made earlier, it's communicating. How do you communicate? And being able to distill the information that you have into something that you can provide. It's provided to leadership. So last week you focused on your video, you focused on the risk management. Yesterday you got details of your technical infrastructure. And so this week you're going to take I didn't count them up, 2 dozen pages plus all the data that you're going to gather this week. You're going to distill it into a document that you're going to provide to the security documentation team. We're going to grade that, and that's going to be worth 1,000 points towards your score in this CyberForce competition. So the next quiz, this is one that everybody should be able to understand. How many points separate the top 10 teams? Typically, we've mentioned, I think, in one of the prior calls. So for those that are listening, go ahead and type in chat. How many points do you anticipate will separate the top 10 teams at this competition? All right. So the point spread, okay, I'm seeing several of them there. The top 10 teams are separated well under 500 points. I would say 200. I don't think we keep statistics on that. Some years, I think it's even gone down to 100 points. So If you don't fill out the security documentation, you're losing 1,000 points off the top. So submit something. That's my plea for every team, is to submit something. Because if you don't submit, you get a 0. If you submit something, we can give you partial credit, and that could move you up in the rankings. Actually, it can move you quite significantly up in the rankings. So we have today, if you've got questions, please put them in the chat as we go along. I wanted to start off with the, here we go. Was just that, notice that, documentation is important. It's not what we decided to major on in college, but it's something that will define the success of our careers. So that, all right, now that I've shared, I have lost, let's see if I can get chat back. Oh, good. I can get the chat back. Alrighty. Alrighty, so that we've got the note there. So we've got, I guess, 88 teams that submitted C-suite videos. 12 more teams are leaving points on the table if they don't get those submitted. Security documentation, again, 1,000 points. That's a significant amount of points. So that's the rubric I will start off with. We have given everybody a template to work with. And that we'll cover a bit of this. One of the things that's emphasized in the videos is don't identify who your team is. So just stick with your team number. It's got to include your team ID. The last thing we want to do is to spend time trying to figure out who's, oops, all right. Who's, all right. Now whose document goes where? And again, don't reference your college or your university. There's just a few sections that are in the documentation that you need to complete. They are listed in the rubric. The overview, the asset inventory, network diagram, known vulnerability, system hardening, and professionalism. You have already seen these because they came out in the overview, rules, and scoring. And if by now you should all have taken some time to read through the rules. So, okay. And all righty. So I'm going to walk you through just walk you through the template and see what we have here. The system overview, the style that we've used for the template here is, breaks into the sections. We ask you, give you a prompt there for what you need to do. Followed by that prompt, there is, a statement of why we're prompting you with that. In this case, we want to know what the overall system is and its purpose. And the rationale behind that is pretty simple. You can't secure a system if you don't know what all of its components are. You don't know what the hardware is that's being put into that. Now, we also give you a note here that the audience for this, again, is the senior leadership. This is your C-suite, the executives. So this is a section, we've already given you one hint, 250 words. That's not a whole lot. So this is literally that, an overview. It's your executive summary. You're not going to put jargon in here because This is a concise statement that you want to, that should be understandable by all. Your chief financial officer, as well as the chief executive and your CISO, your security officer. If you come into the rubrics, the notes here, not provided 0 points, are going all the way to the exemplary. The goal for everybody should be to target that exemplary. Again, do the best you can within the time that is allotted. But we can see here, this in proficient, the system and its purposes are defined well. When you go to exemplary, we take that same statement and now we add on this notion of it's defined well in clear, plain language. You're not going to be using the jargon. It's something that you can give to your roommate, your parents, somebody else that they can read and they would understand it. And that's kind of this notion of senior leadership. So target it for them. You have read through the intelligence report. You have gotten your blue team ICS document. You've been able to read through that. Go ahead, and this is probably the last section that you're going you'll draft it, but then I think you'll want to come back after you're done with the whole document and rewrite it. It seems to me, at least that's how I always end up writing. I have this brilliant idea, I put an abstract down, then I write my paper, and then I realize it doesn't match the abstract. So then rather than rewrite the paper, I rewrite the abstract to match. So probably a similar process you'll want to do there. So go through, describe its system and its purposes. The next section is the asset inventory. So and this is list all the systems, devices by name and the key attributes in the following table. So we have given you a hint here for the formatting, and asset management. It's just something that you have to do. It's a basic skill in cybersecurity, especially when you're working with operational technology. You need to know the systems that you're working with. All right. So we're going to do that. So for everybody that has read through the documents, how many assets are you going to be protecting? How many virtual machines are going to be in your infrastructure? Okay, I've got a little bit of 4. Anyone want to go higher? Okay. We've got 6 plus Mapbox. Okay, so I'm seeing more votes for 7. Actually, if I did this 6 plus 1, we're at 7. So not going to tell you how many ports are open on all of those systems, but just based on the chat here, you're going to need at least 7 rows filled out in this asset inventory. So you're going to list all of those. The documentation provides information on the operating system. You're going to need to fill in the IP address, the ports and the services. So that is what you need to work with. So there's a good question there that aren't we supposed to not touch the map box? The same goes with your assumed breach. You can look at them but not touch, but they are part of your asset inventory. So you need to list, even if you're not going to touch it, it's still in your environment. It's something that you need to document. All right. So we can see here that, again, as Amanda said, you're not going to touch it, but you can document that it exists. All right. So yes, I would include the fact that you have a map box in your asset inventory. So here, for proficient, most of the hosts are listed. Most of the services are listed. If you are exemplary, you're going to list all of your hosts. You're gonna list all of the services. The you're not gonna leave out any of the details in that table. You're gonna have the OS, the IP, the port details are all provided. And all is a squishy term, so we're gonna define that as, you're gonna get, A-level effort, 90% or better on your listings there. So again, host, OS, IP address, port, and the service. All right. And yeah, so the question to Timothy, my understanding of the rules is yes, you can do your scanning, you can do your observations, but your assumed breach machines need to be left as is. If you fix things, you are potentially jeopardizing points on Saturday. And that was explained in a prior Fireside chat. So the asset inventory you have, the second piece that exists is the network diagram. All right, so Amanda's giving you a better answer in chat on your assumed breach machines and such. All right, and then the network diagram. This is you're going to scan your environment. You've got access to your AWS environment. You know what VMs exist. You're going to document this and a diagram for use, and that it enables you or provides more situational awareness when you're discussing things. That visual graphic that's there for people to see can get you all on the same page. Now, we don't care so much about whether exactly how you draw this. It could be, I pulled together a few files I forgot to bring up. And some of the resources that we have given you, you do have examples of 4 network diagram examples. So let me, just, you can see that the first one that we had listed for you, we've already established, your the benefit you got for attending today's Fireside is it's confirmed you're going to have 7 boxes of VMs listed. Here we can see there was only 5 that were listed, no connections, just things in a circle. It doesn't even come close to representing the diagram. Then, you can read through these on your own time, but we've progressed up towards the end. And we made a point when we did these example diagrams a few years ago of including basically a photo of a whiteboard. We are looking for the content, and that so if you find it quicker to find a whiteboard or just a pad of paper and to draw it all out by hand and take a picture of that, that is perfectly fine. We don't have an expectation that you're going to learn a whole new software package. It's Visios, and some might have access to Draw.io, another tool. That, do what you're comfortable with and document that network. So if I come, okay, oops, I lose track of where. There we go. So the network diagram, again, for proficient exemplary, exemplary, you're going to include all of the assets, as well as showing how they're logically connected. If you're including the wide area network or the internet at large and such in your diagram, that then you should clearly know what systems exist in the internet at large, what exists within your own AWS environment. The diagrams make logical sense. the grader should be able to look at it and say, oh yeah, that makes sense. We recognize that most of you have not done a network diagram, and this is one of the reasons why we include this assignment, is just to get you thinking about how would you document your network diagram, how, if you get to the point in the future where you've got a home lab, how do you document that, talk to other people about it, but it's logical is a little bit, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but there are some things that just don't make sense. So try not to do that. There are many accepted symbols that the profession uses. Reuse those symbols. If you're not, if you don't have access to a icon library for those, then put in a legend so we know what your symbols mean. Again, that's a pro tip for any documentation that you're doing or other reports as well, to find the symbols used in your graphs and diagrams. So this is your network diagram. Your network diagram is worth 25% of your overall security documentation score. And you will see is that there is an asterisk that's listed here for the network diagram and the asset inventory. And it's, both of those should be consistent. So we don't want to, if there's assets listed in your asset inventory, then they need to be shown in the network diagram as well. And vice versa. So make those consistent. So those are two big pieces that we have. I'll pause for a second. If there's any questions, go ahead and put those in the chat. Then the next section, known vulnerabilities. This is a biggie, 25% of your points. And again, we have in your template, which we're walking through, okay, the list of assets. All right, so the list of assets is, your blue team, AWS and VPS instructions. I would read through that. And when you log into your AWS environment, you've got a dashboard that tells you all the VMs that exist. So you're just going to spend time going through those documents to identify what you have. So it's a great question. And, think of the graders as like your professor. They don't want to spend the time reading everything. They want you to summarize it all. Same with the C-suite. This is a 6-page document for the VPS, or AWS and VPN instructions, the rules themselves. Any more pages than that, you're going to distill all that content into the simple lists and graphics. The vulnerabilities, as some of you have probably got logged into your environment, some of you are still juggling coursework and such, and haven't gotten into it yet. But once you start looking at it, you're going to find a lot of vulnerabilities. If the documentation gives you a little hint here, if you don't find a weak user password somewhere, then well, that's just one of the things you're going to want to look for. And in this case, if you got a weak password on one of your devices, call out, the username and the weak password. If it's on an assumed breach, you're not going to be able to fix it. You need to leave it there until Saturday when the red team tells you to fix it. If it's on your traditional infrastructure, by all means, fix, secure your systems, update your passwords, so they won't be easily broken into. So like I said, you list each vulnerability, and for the vulnerabilities, that's only half of it. you also need to go through and list mitigations for those as well. And these, I'll talk more about system hardening in the next section, but they kind of go part and parcel together. And we give you some hints to fill out the table. If Alice, Bob, and Carol all have weak passwords, it merits one line in the table. But if you got different classes of passwords, network admin on 3 different hosts, that you're going to then list the line for each host. And there's also this other note. Some of the times you're going, one of the things of this competition that's critical is time management. You might spend all of your time discovering your vulnerabilities. That's awesome. You also give yourself some time to mitigate them. But if you discovered them, still take credit for it, even if you haven't gotten around to mitigating the steps or the mitigating the vulnerabilities. And again, we're going to target the senior leadership. So, citing the CVE title, giving a high-level overview. Weak user passwords will be sufficient. You don't have to say they violated company policy 123.4, paragraph 2, with a 6-character password. You can generalize that to they've got a weak user password. Now, provide enough details that the graders know what you're doing, but again, try and stay out of the weeds, because if we wanted to read the vulnerability scan, the raw results, we could have chosen to read those. That's not what we're doing. We're trying to read your summary of what's been done. So again, known vulnerabilities. We've got, we've identified many. I can tell you, we list 23. 23 is a very low estimate. You should be able to find many, many more than that. But you can ask all you want in the chat today. I'm not going to tell you how many known vulnerabilities there are. I do know that the red team was very busy, and they have left you surprises on every one of your virtual machines. We also want to know that the vulnerabilities have an appropriate mitigation. If user foo had a weak password, the mitigation is to toss them off of the box, delete the account. That's not an appropriate mitigation, because we're assuming that that user was added to that box, to that system for a reason. If you're going to, but if you know it's a rogue account, then explain it's a rogue account. There's no user that matches that. Just make sure that that your system works and that you have tested with the scoreboard to ensure that you get credit for all your system services. So again, for that exemplary, appropriate mitigations. And again, as I've said, we're going to target a senior leadership audience. Okay. The next section, this is more free form. Again, we have a constraint here, 1,250 words or less. That's about a page or two. Depends on your writing style, font, and all of that. So you're going to describe the procedures your teams use to harden and defend your system for the competition. What steps did you go through to lock down your systems to discover what was there? These at this level would be steps you could take year in and year out. The CVEs will change from year to year as new 0 days, other vulnerabilities are identified, but your hardening steps will be somewhat consistent. Are you going to look for weak passwords? Are you looking for unpatched software? What are the steps that you're taking? And include the list of the tools that you've done. Give us some of that backup documentation so that we know that you did what you said you were going to do. So that, as it says, the justification here, if you're going to be responsible for a network and IT and OT systems, you've got to get out in front of the adversary, and so you've got to harden them. You've got to decide how often you're going to patch them, how often are you scanning for vulnerabilities, how often are you vetting your users and their identities, so on and so forth. You can't wait until CISA or Dewey Caesar or somebody else comes out and says there's a known vulnerability. At that point, the adversary is also reading all of those emails and scanning the same web pages. So if they didn't know about it ahead of time, they will learn about it as soon as you learn about it, and the race is on. So you want to get out in front as much as you can. So again, if you're professional, you're establishing, a high level of maturity. You've got a day-to-day practice to enable excellence. All right. So there's the hardening. Again, proficient and exemplary. You've got 3 or more or 4 or more steps that are taken. That you can just the comprehensive and technically sound. Going through exemplary, you've got a strong justification for the steps you took or didn't take. Sometimes it's equally important to explain why you didn't take an action. So if there's something you chose not to do, you've got sound justification, go ahead and list that as well. You're free to do that. And the steps taken are reasonable. And again, this competition, you can only use open source or the freely available or the free tool sets. Amanda has covered those in the general rules, and they're also covered in the overall overview rules and scoring document that you have. So you've got those steps there. Again, this is free form. So in the in the chat, we'll go interactive again. How many words are in a web application scanner report or a Nessus scan or any of these other vulnerability scanners? When you get the raw report out, how many words are in those reports? All right, well, the first answer I'm seeing here, too many, exactly. In past years, is that, all right, just one answer then. In past years, we have had teams that have attached their raw vulnerability scan. We don't want to read 30 pages of raw scan data. Your manager is never going to read 30 pages, 60 pages, or 100 pages of raw scan data. They're paying you good money to read that, summarize it, and report back to them. And if you can do that, you will be a valuable employee. And I'll get to the question in just a second. Again, that was one of the things that was brought out, where we've got multiple national labs, industry, and other partners at the supply chain risk management conference. They've mentioned the ability to take and look at all of your raw data and identify the quote, so what? You've got all this data. What does it mean? Why do I care? What's the business case for fixing things? How do I motivate the C-suite to take action? So that's distilling all of those reports into a page or two of text. That's what this exercise is about. What have you done? Okay, we've got the question from William. The hardening steps are general steps for the whole system. So if you're checking for weak passwords, I'm assuming, and I would recommend you do it across all of your VMs. You're not just going to do it on one VM, because then the rest of them are unprotected, or you don't know what their status is. So again, the hardening steps are what you've done to lock everything down. Now, if you've done this often, you might already have a playbook that says we did this and then that and the other thing. That's fine. Tell us what you did and the results and how successful that was. If you're a team that this is your first year or you're a rookie team, welcome. We're more than glad to have you. You might just be, trying things out to figure out what works. Might be a whole lot more ad hoc and not as methodical. But again, document what you've done and explain it. And then, we will, the rubric is the contract that we have with you. So if you've got, those 4 hardening steps and they're reasonable, that's excellent. And, you meet all the criteria for the exemplary column, we'll award exemplary points. Any other questions on hardening? And that was the last section in the template itself that you've been given. All right, so in the rubric, 7% of the points is professionalism and formatting. So we want, the document has an aesthetic appeal. Again, the high criteria here. Correct terminology is used throughout. And no major spelling or grammatical errors. So whatever tool you're using these days, most every tool has built-in spell check. So, take advantage of that. I would, have your colleagues on your team read the document. If you've got a roommate or a friend or somebody else that's willing to read it, go ahead and have them read it, just to make sure that have a look for the grammar and the spelling errors and such like that, just to make sure that the document reads well and is presentable. One of the advantages that we have at the national labs is we have dedicated technical writers and editors that we can lean on. After we've written the technical content, we will go through and take a pass through it. But these are the English majors, and they will help us. They'll reread a document, and they'll remind us of things that we worded poorly or fix some of the English mistakes that we have made. That helps us polish our documents. And if I were taking something to the lab director or something that I knew was going to get presented to DOE headquarters, I would want to have someone else review it. So again, practice like you're going to play. So go ahead and have someone else read your documentation, just to make sure it looks well. The aesthetic appeal, if every page is a different font and font size, that just tells us that you're not minding all the little basics. It just doesn't have that aesthetic feel. And if you don't have consistency in your fonts and font sizes, again, it just calls into question how much effort did you put into the technical content as well. They're not always correlated, but if you can't make, some of the times we make the assumption, if you can't handle the small details, you didn't get the big details right either. It's a bit unfair at times, but it's something that happens often. So that is the rubric. We have gone through that. We have gone through the the template top to bottom. We had the question on where do you get your information? And like I said, AWS and VPN instructions. If you read through that document, it gives you a lot of the details that you will need. So that, go ahead and open that up, look through that. And there's yeah, a picture two of the, dashboards of, what you're going to expect once you log into AWS. So you have that information as well. There'll be a few things that you find in the overall document. And the one question that I'm sure Ann would ask if I don't beat her to the punch is, when is your security documentation due? Somebody's read through the rules. It's due Monday. Okay. All right. So William lives on the East Coast. I live on the West Coast. So my time reference is, Pacific time, 8 a.m. Pacific time. Yep. So just for your own time zone, and get that to us on Monday at 8 Pacific. Oh, and that'll be right after the time change. So I think, yeah, fall back, so you'll get a bonus hour.
Yes, they do.
Now, yeah.
And if you totally miss it and think you have a bonus 2 hours and you're late, what's the deadline for submitting? Or you're late, penalty provided document. They're looking this one up. Either that or I'm not going to be late. It's all right. I don't need to know that deadline. That's what I like.
I know there's a late deadline. I am terrible.
The penalty is too many points. You're right.
And to me, your mental health is also important. If you want to declare it done on Monday so you can get on with your life, just declare it done on Monday. If you have things that come up and you have to go to your brother's wedding, this coming weekend, and you can't work on it, life happens. We understand that. Go to the wedding and submit late. But Patrick, the penalty for not submitting at all is 100%.
Yeah.
It took a long time for us to help one of our children understand that a zero is a zero is a zero. Averaging out a zero is just painful. So submit something, and you'll get points, and that will really help you on the leaderboard wherever you are.
Thank you, Amanda, for helping them out. November 6th, 8 a.m. And some of you are going, but we got more time for our late videos. Yes, that's because that's this week. Next week, we're all busy getting these graded and submitted in time for your competition.
Yeah, we are on a very tight schedule to get the documents graded. And just like the videos, we will have several graders that will read through these, score them. So, and we also do the analysis to make sure that the grading is consistent. Every year we have a happy grader and a grumpy grader. We look for that. So and if it's a really grumpy grader, then we will assign someone else to grade a project so that you get a consistent score, a fair score that'll show up on the scoreboard, I think sometime Saturday.
And not to mention, you all will be traveling, so you don't want to have to try and submit something late when you're traveling. We're just taking that off the plate for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Get it submitted. it's always a comparison. So if I'm going to turn in something, it's only worth 500 points on Monday on time because I did such a bad job. But I know that I can, me or my team can do enough work that we're going to earn pretty close to the 1,000 points, such that when I get a 25% deduction, I'm earning 750 points. Then it might be worth doing it late. Might. Now, if you're just going to continue to do a bad job, then you might as well turn it in on time and get not have the penalty.
Yeah. Like I said, we recognize you have classwork and you're also gonna want to spend time hardening your systems. And yeah, if you've managed to, patch the software to, mitigate the vulnerabilities, claim credit. If you were waiting to get everything done before you turn it in, just say that I will do this in the next 3 days and turn it in on time. And then spend your time, the next 3 days, fixing things that you claim that you're going to do, but just try and respect the deadline and move on. All right. Yep.
Yes, as Amanda answered, on Mapbox, you don't have access to it, so you don't know the vulnerabilities. You need to list it as an asset, include it on your network diagram because you know it's there, but you're going to make a statement. We don't have access to this.
Mhm.
You can just say we don't have access, vulnerabilities are not identified yet. That way you can be sure that your graders, your scorers will understand that. Okay.
Yeah. And we'll train the graders on what, but again, that disclaimer again is very important. You can, if you're working for a company and you know that, the president or CEO always likes to bring in a laptop from home and plug it into the corporate network, you'll throw your hands up in the air. It's like, we haven't scanned it, it's a disclaimer. It's like the CEO won't let us patch, his or her laptop. Just, state it and move on. All right, so Jared asking, is it a flat network or a switch or a router? That's for you to discover in the next few days, so that you can document it in your diagram. The map box, I read a little bit, but Amanda probably knows more about it. You want to take it?
You will not need to do anything with. It is entirely for use for your industrial control system on the day of the competition, but it's required to be in your network, so it speaks to your ICS. So you don't need to do anything with it, Gabriella. You just, again, to the point, is part of your network, so you do need to identify it in your network diagram. You need to identify it as an asset, but you can't log into it because you don't even have access to it.
All right. And then Jared, if you can't change it in AWS or you've been given instructions not to change it, you document your network as is. If you are part of a computer emergency response team and you got flown to a site to help them recover from a disastrous network breach, first thing you're going to do is document their network. You're going to document it as is. You may or may not be given permissions to change things, but you're going to document the as-built. Same thing with this competition. All right. So, You know what your subnet is. So go ahead and document that. That is part of your, in the, your blue team, AWS and VPN.
So to, I guess, elongate the answer here, because I think some probably are, so for Jared and for others who maybe are new, or maybe don't overcomplicate it or overthink this. While this is in AWS and we've definitely way complicated and locked down everything, it's because what's built in AWS, you're not meant to look at it because you're going to look at it as a, like, how did we build it? What did we do? Look at this as if it's your company and this is just 7 VMs and this is how they're set up. So you are set with your subnet. So explain how these would be connected, are connected, whether you're right, you're wrong. It's all in the details, devil's in the details here in your security documentation. So if you believe this is how it's connected, explain why you believe it's connected that way. It shouldn't be super difficult. You don't need AWS to show you your network diagram and how it's built out. So at the end of the day, it would make 0 sense for you to understand how it's built out on an admin level, because there's 110 somethings built out on this network. So worry about yours. You have a subnet. It's clearly documented in both the rules, this AWS and VPN document. So look at it as this is my company and how is it set up?
Yeah, you're documenting your piece. You're not documenting all of the work that has gone into setting up the, 100 team infrastructure in AWS. So keep it simple, focus on your 7 VMs. Uh, any other questions? I could add an off-topic question. I think last year we had more Halloween costumes showing up in the memes channels. I think we've been a little bit light, but we're still, a day or two away from Halloween. So not that that's going to get you any security documentation points, but I figured I'd just, lighten the mood a bit.
I don't think we can answer the question about the s'mores at the Q Center. That's not related to security documentation.
Yeah, I think you're going to have to come to that fireside chat in person in real life and find out if there are s'mores or not. Someone will also have to order good weather. And again, that's not part of this.
We are bringing our person who gives out hugs. We are definitely bringing her.
Okay. All right, so that's the extent to which mentors can help. That's a rules question, not a documentation question. Just so post that to Discord. Yep, send a ticket.
Likewise, note that AI will not give you the right answers to this task. It will give you answers, but it will not give you the answers. But don't worry, we have people who love to sort out whether it's AI or not, and we'll be happy to provide you with the appropriate scoring.
Yeah. someday Skynet will take over, but that day is not today or tomorrow.
Any other questions in regards to security documentation for David or Anne? Alrighty. Oh, here's one. Do you want CVE numbers?
If you got CVE numbers, go ahead and feel free to list them. And, you know, again, just see, do a sanity check as to whether they're appropriate. You probably don't want, some CVE numbers are more useful than others. It depends on what level you are going to be documenting everything. And again, you've got more flexibility on listing your vulnerabilities. The system hardening, you've got a defined word count. But again, in both cases, if you give the judges 50 pages to read, they won't be happy. We'll leave that one up a little bit to you.
I think it's meant to, the template definitely is meant to be try to stick to the template as close to possible. That's why we make it. I think prior to the template, we've had people turn in 1 page of a security documentation. We've had people turn in like 30 pages of security documentation. So we did the template on purpose because we know that you guys have a week to do this. And to David's point, to harden, to find things in your stuff. So don't think because you go, I filled this space and I have so much more. We know there's no way you're going to be able to fill out that template and do it to 100% accuracy of what you should find in your systems. But do the best you can within limits in the template, but don't go adding 10 pages to that document, because at some point we're going to have to tell our graders like that's excessive and you might actually lose points because they're not going to read it. So just be mindful of that in editing a template. I know that at least at my lab, and I presume probably at P&L and at others, they're not key fans of people editing templates when they're specifically made for a purpose. So slight edits are fine, but don't go making things so that they're just, you know, more convenient for you. We know it's not a beautiful template, but it's meant to just get the job done for the purpose of the rubric to help the graders. So just keep that in mind when you're building it out.
Yeah, and I looked at the template. We do list some CVE numbers there as examples. So in that case, you know, the CVE number is shorthand for the vulnerability itself. So if you've got that handy, go ahead and list it. If it's not convenient, don't feel like you have to track down a CVE number for everything you found, just list it out. And like I said, this template is to help focus you on content rather than have you spend hours focusing on presentation. I know there are some days where I spend way too much time formatting my text instead of actually writing the text. We want you to focus on writing the text. The users, they're supposed to be on the system. Some of that's documented again in your blue team ICS documentation. You're also going to be able to enumerate the users as you get access to your systems. So that's an exercise for you. And as far as the number of vulnerabilities for every server, you need to have, you know, over 23. That's the hard number in the rubric. How they're spread across the different servers, that was up to the red team, but at the first glance of what I looked at, the red team did not have a favorite. It looks like they gave every one of the VMs some care and attention. So if you can't find something on a VM, you probably need to keep looking.
I think to add to that for Gabriella and others, like, don't be specific to just one VM. There's minus the map, the 7th, there's 6 VMs. So you should try to spread the wealth so that graders know that you did take the time to look at all of them, because in part that's what they're looking for. Again, you cannot edit the assumed breach VMs, which are 3, but you can find vulnerabilities on them and you can outline them. So please understand that you can find vulnerabilities, you can outline them in the security documentation. You should be doing that. You can't alter them. So they are expecting to see all 6 VMs on your security documentation with vulnerabilities. So don't be just writing 23 vulnerabilities from one server.
If you stop at 24, the red team will own your system on Saturday. You know, there's way more than 23. We just have to pick an arbitrary number as we head to press, and we head to press before the red team is done. So every year there's somebody that stops at like 23 or 24 and says, oh, you hit the rubric, but you should have kept working. You can find many more, and as the rubric says, we will not tell you how many more. But again, this is one of those things where you have to do the cost benefit analysis. You need to sleep. So trying to get every single last one, you'll set aside how much time you want to spend. And when you hit that threshold, call it good. If you're less than 23, then maybe you need to spend a little bit more time, revise your time budget, or just stick with the budget that you had for this competition. But if you hit 23 in the first 5 minutes, well, then you might want to keep on looking until the rate of discovery really starts to drop. Let's see. Yeah.
You can continue securing after you submit security documentation. In fact, you could be using your security documentation as a plan for what you're securing, right? It doesn't have to be, I secured that, now I document it, right? That's your plan.
All right, we've got somebody that's enthusiastic and young that's going to spend a sleepless week just working on CyberForce. It'll get you a good CyberForce score. You're somebody that doesn't sleep and eat would not be somebody that I'd want on my team in real life, because they're going to burn out. And you know, with this, we are working, you know, not 24/7, 365. We're working, you know, 40 hours a week, week in and week out. So you have to work at a sustainable level. When breaches happen, you put in some overtime to clean things up, but you really need to find a company and where you can put in the amount of work that you want to put and find your right work-life balance.
Alrighty. For 7:06, well, at least Central Time here, it's just after 5 for you all and your Pacific time there. I think questions have dwindled. If there are more, please feel free to throw them again in Discord in a ticket. If it does rise to the level in which we feel it's good for the entire group, we will make an announcement for people. But in the event, we appreciate you all joining us tonight for our last Fireside. You will get an email from me on Monday next week to go over logistics for the end of the week. Can you believe it? We're a week and a half out. If you can't tell the twitch in my eye, it's starting. So get yourselves packed. Weather is probably gonna be chilly, so get yourselves your extra hoodies out. We're finishing our 80-degree round weather today and tomorrow, and we will be back into the cold, wet weather here. So without further ado, have a great night, everyone, and I will see you in person next week. Talk to you later.
Thanks for coming.